Well, I realized when I put all of this stuff together for this third video that I'd already done a lot of sort of the pre-work on this. So this ended up being a little bit different than I thought it would be, and hopefully it will be a little bit more concise. We'll have to see. I've had a beer, so we'll have to see how that works. But this is looking more at the kind of the cultural things that we're aware of with regard to early Christians. A little bit about texts, but much more about some of the communities and their relationship to some of the texts. What we know based on how they talked about each other, what historical records exist, etc. So what were Christians doing in between all of their committee meetings? Well, one thing we do know is that Christian communities were very obsessed with the image of Jesus, in the sense that there wasn't a lot that was known about him. I mean, if you read the Gospels, there's not really a clear description of what he looked like. And as the communities became more and more Gentile, more and more Greek, and more Roman, that's really sort of how Jesus began to look, especially by the end of the first century. You know, the kind of bearded dude with dark skin that white skin that has recently become darkened because we know now that, you know, he wasn't a white European. Those are all recent depictions of Jesus. Jesus, in the earliest portraits we have of him, looks very much like a young Greek dude, honestly. Clean-shaven, short hair, often nice, rather nicely dressed. He looks sort of like a Greek middle-class person, you know, that maybe has some philosophical kinds of affectations. He's also often seen as a healer. In fact, the earliest depictions that we have of him from a devotional standpoint are him as being a healer, and then later on a philosopher and a teacher. He's not portrayed on the cross, because I think, as I mentioned in the previous video, that would not have been a way in which you would want to have portrayed your Savior. You know, even if he had been crucified, you wanted to show him at his honorable best. So this is, as far as we know, this picture on the left is the earliest known portrait, or one of the earliest known portraits of Jesus, and he's being depicted here as a healer. And it is probably the story, if I'm looking at the picture correctly, it's probably the story that you find in a couple of the Gospels where he's been called to the house of a child who is ill, and he's healing that person. And this individual, as you can see, he's the figure in the middle of the picture. He's dressed in a nice Greek toga. He's got short hair, very much like a Roman or a Greek citizen. So he doesn't look at all Jewish at all. Now keep in mind that there was not, in Roman society, skin color was not, it didn't have the same importance to the Romans as it does to us today. The Romans, for all of their problems that they had, they did not divide people up by race. They did not have an idea of race such as we know it today. Whether you were civilized or not had absolutely nothing to do with skin color. We know this because some of the emperors were of African origin and were pretty dark. So, and you know, they were these, you know, most Romans were what we would call Italians now, so they were not, you know, white people. But there was a range of skin colors, obviously, in the empire as a whole, and you know, the Roman Empire ruled over, you know, hundreds of different ethnic groups. So, you know, this isn't an example of Jesus being made white, I guess is what I'm trying to say. This is an example of Jesus being made Roman or Greek, which is a little bit different, actually. Now, these are a couple of other depictions of, the one on the left we would presume is Jesus, because we see someone being depicted on a cross, or something being depicted on a cross. And this is actually a example of really negative Christian graffiti. It's basically making fun of a guy named Alexandros, who apparently is a Christian, and it's depicting a donkey, or a donkey or a horse on the cross. And the inscription apparently says something to the effect of, "This is Alexandros' God is this horse's ass on a cross," or something like that. It's something to that effect. So it's making fun of Christians. These dudes, they worship some dude on a cross. And it dates probably to the late 1st century, early 2nd century. And then on the right is another early depiction of Jesus, again as a healer. This is from the story of the woman who reached out and touched Jesus's robe and was healed. And again, he is portrayed as kind of this is the manner in which he's dressed. He's portrayed as kind of a Greek intellectual, actually. So that's how he's being portrayed here. So Christians were obsessed about what Jesus might have looked like, but they were also obsessed about what Jesus's teachings meant. What you have to remember and understand is that there was no set theology then. There was no single authority. There was no Bible in the beginning, right? So most Christian communities maybe at most had maybe one text, like the Gospel of Mark or a Pauline epistle that they would share, that they would read aloud, and that was it, And if they got, because you had to have someone who was able to copy a text, and someone who could pay for the copying of the text, right? So a lot of Christian communities were very limited in terms of the texts that they had access to. This doesn't mean, however, that they didn't communicate with each other over time. And as I say down here in the larger print in the notes, that one way in which many scholars have looked at even the texts that are in the New Testament, that were regarded as canon, the Gospels and the epistles and the act that is there. But even if you look at some of the others that didn't make it into the canon, one of the ways in which you can think about all these different varieties is that most of these became associated. Some of them were actually completely associated, but some came to be associated with certain regions or certain communities. And so you can kind of see them as sort of position papers, like this is the way that Jesus is to us. This is how we see him. This is what we were taught about him. There were some communities, for example, that were considered themselves to be of the lineage of Paul. They were considered Pauline. And so they would tend to try to collect his letters or copies of his letters in order to see what other things he might have said. And this is what led to the collections of his epistles in some instances. So basically these different communities would then, share with each other about, the Christian tradition that had developed in their village or in their city or in their neighborhood. Early Christianity was much less text and book oriented than it was community centered. And so all of the early rituals of the early Christian community, which as far as we can tell were very simple, they tended to revolve around versions of the Last Supper. That seemed to be a fairly well-known and popular story. It was referred to as the love feast. And it wasn't it wasn't like it is now. It wasn't like the Mass. It was not an elaborate ritual. Mostly what it consisted of is, we call it like a potluck. You know, people would come together. It would usually be organized in specific homes. Oftentimes it was the women who organized it. And people would come, and they would bring food if they had it, and if they didn't, they would share what food they had with others who did not have. And they would tell stories about Jesus, things that they'd heard. If a guest teacher had come into town, that guest teacher would come and, talk. And they would share food and share prayers and share songs. And so, some of those songs have survived. Like, for example, at the beginning of the Gospel of John, a lot of people don't know this, but in the Greek, it's very clearly a hymn. It's very clearly an early song. It rhymes. It has a kind of a rhythm, and can be chanted very easily. And there are a number of other places in the New Testament. I think Paul actually quotes a couple of what are obviously songs that he has picked up or learned from Christian communities, or he's transmitting. So that was kind of the way that they operated. The earliest commemorations, as far as we know, involved around this love feast, and then also some of the early stories that were told about Jesus, and then eventually commemorations of his resurrection. That came a little bit later, but the first kind of full-blown ritual that we have about Jesus, connected to Jesus and his resurrection, that I'm aware of, actually comes from a Gnostic text. So it was a Gnostic Christian text, and it's very clearly kind of a theatrical sort of wedding ceremony that was conducted. It's in the Pistis Sophia, and that was conducted within the confines of the community, and represented a kind of representation of, or a symbolic recital, if you will, of the spiritual significance of Jesus's resurrection and ascension. It's actually the text is beautiful. It's very lovely poetry. So this was the kind of thing that early Christian communities did. This is before you have the Mass, before you have, the highfalutin rituals that we have now. Christians sort of created their practices as they went, based on things that they knew and what was being transmitted to them from Christian teachers who would come, to these travel around and come to these different villages and towns and cities. There were early Jewish Christians. In fact, there are good attestations of Jewish Christian communities going pretty far into the 2nd century. They became more and more marginalized as time went by and as the communities became more and more Gentile. And there were two basic kinds of Jewish communities. There were Jewish Christians who still attempted to follow the Mosaic law. And they were often sort of looked down on. And in fact, there's some indication of that relatively early, even in the Pauline epistles. Or actually, I think it's in either, I can't remember, it's 1st or 2nd Peter in the New Testament. But there's this, like a dream that Peter has, in which he sees he has a dream that he's in front of a table that has been set with lots of food, and a lot of the food is unclean food. It's not kosher, essentially. And he doesn't really want to eat it because he doesn't feel comfortable, and a voice comes from heaven and says, all this food is fine. So that's clearly a dig at Jewish Christians, in one way or another. Whether Peter actually had that dream or not, we have no idea. So there were a lot of other Jewish communities that over time began to resemble their Gentile neighbors. They may have retained certain cultural vestiges of Judaism, but they, they relaxed a lot of the more strict taboos. And it's believed that the community that produced the Gospel of Matthew was probably one of these communities. It was clearly a Jewish community, a Jewish Christian community that the Gospel of Matthew came out of. Now, the former Jewish Christians, the ones that tried to retain the Jewish law, came to be called Ebionites, which was kind of a pejorative term. It sort of meant something like, the poor dudes who don't get it, that kind of thing. And they became more and more marginalized throughout the 2nd century. Now, it's often said that Christianity appealed to the working classes. I mean, that's sort of how it's pitched sometimes, because of how Jesus himself in the stories appears to not have very many prejudices about the working class. And as a carpenter, he was a member of the working class. So, that sort of makes sense. In fact, Christianity, what we know of it, tended to appeal mostly to the middle class. Those were the individuals among the Gentiles who took to it most readily, probably because of Paul. Paul himself was of a middle class, and he was a well-spoken and an honorary Roman citizen. And so that is probably, when he would go to a community, that's probably the type of people that would take him in. Now, that being said, it is also true that one of the things that the Love Feast was known for is that anybody could come to them, at least when it was being done right. I mean, I'm sure that there were places where this wasn't true, but it was a place where anybody who professed Christianity, anybody who professed being a disciple of Christ or Jesus, could come, regardless of your status, regardless of whether you were a master or a slave or a male or female or a Jew or Gentile. You could come. There is this famous passage in one of Paul's letters where he says, in Christ there is no male or female, there is no master or slave, there is no Jew or Gentile, because those were the main divisions of society, that he was familiar with. And so for him, that's what Christianity was. It was a religion that somehow obviated these differences. And so there were instances where Christians attempted to allow the Love Feast to sort of reflect that, a place where people from very different locations in Roman society and Greek society, which were very class conscious and very gender divided, to meet and to talk about whatever this new religion might mean. And as I mentioned, in the early Christian church, and there is evidence of this in the New Testament itself, especially in the very beginning, women were often really important organizers, intermediaries and networkers in these early churches. And in fact, this became an issue later on as the urban churches became more Roman. And so you can see that in some of the later letters. Timothy, for example, is a famous one where all of a sudden women are ordered to keep silent, are ordered not to cut their hair, are ordered not to speak in church, and that was not the case in the earliest church, But as the churches became more Roman, Roman culture was extremely patriarchal and did not permit women many opportunities for public life. And so, and of course that carried on then as Christianity became the Roman religion and was established in an ecclesiastical structure. Women became more and more marginalized. So there are lots of different versions of Jesus that you find, even in the texts that are canon, but certainly in the larger community. I've mentioned the Gnostic Christians. There's a wide variety of, because I'm going to talk about Gnosticism in a later video. But Gnosticism was a very kind of complex it was more of a mode of thinking. It wasn't one thing. It was a mode of mystical, philosophical thought. Is probably the best way of putting it. And not all Gnostics were Christians. In fact, most were not. Most were pagans or not particularly religious at all. But Gnosticism did impact Christians, and there were many Gnostic Christians. The Nag Hammadi corpus demonstrates that there were many, many Gnostic Christians. And there were some Gnostic ideas that were just in certain cultures, like, for example, the Gospel of Thomas is not a particularly Gnostic text in a lot of ways, but it does have a few Gnostic elements in it. It's not principally a Gnostic text, but it does use some of the language here and there. And even Paul uses some of the language now and there, but he's using it in a different way. But the point is that Gnosticism as a sort of a mode, a way of thinking, was common to lots of people. So one way in which Gnostic Christians could look at Jesus was that he was like a visionary philosopher, as I say, perhaps a glorified human being that really didn't die, but that God somehow translated into heaven. There are some Gnostic Christians for whom the image of Jesus is even more abstract than that. So there were lots of versions, but the Gnostic Christians tended not to emphasize the crucifixion so much. Or if they talked about it at all, it was very an abstract, symbolic kind of way. Then there were the Montanists, and a lot of people don't know about the Montanists. They're like my favorite. They regarded him as Jesus was a herald who proclaimed the coming of the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, that could imbue every Christian with inspiration and guidance. They were very similar to Pentecostals. I mean, startlingly similar to Pentecostals. They even organized their communities in a similar way. And they were based on the teachings of a guy named Montanus, who had this visionary experience of the Paraclete coming to him, and they would speak in tongues and do these healings and do these ecstatic things. I mean, when you read the accounts, they are so much like Pentecostals that it's really kind of startling. And Montanus had two women who assisted him. And so they would travel around together and have the revivals. That's essentially what they were doing. They became very popular in northern Africa. And that's where the post-Nicene or ante-Nicene church father Tertullian encountered them. And he was really impressed with them because, the Romans couldn't tell the difference between these Christians, Montanists, and any other Christians. And so the Montanists got persecuted as well, but they comported themselves perfectly well in the arena and made really good martyrs, and Tertullian was really impressed with them. So he ended up actually converting to Montanism, which was a shock to his community because he was a fairly well-known guy. But anyway, the Montanists are really interesting, and they had their own texts that were revealed texts, and they are one of the early Christian groups that kind of developed the idea of having a corpus of texts, having a bunch of texts that belonged to you, that you could carry around, and they believed that Scripture was ongoing. So they were interesting people. There were some who believed that Jesus was the Redeemer who showed a way of unity with God. This is characteristic of some of the early Orthodox teachings. For example, Jesus was a healer whose spiritual authority could empower others to heal in his name. This is a very early understanding of Jesus. In fact, this view of Jesus is actually alluded to in a part of the New Testament. Paul alludes to it. It's also alluded to in one of the Gospels. Jesus was a spiritual guide who could teach you how to live in the world and build a new kind of community. So there were some Christians who believed that the teachings of Jesus were his life. In other words, it was how he lived. It was not so much that he died and maybe rose again. That may happen, but that wasn't nearly as important as how he lived. And that's a very similar concept to what you'll find in the later Anabaptist communities, like the Mennonites and the Hutterites and things like that. Obviously, some believed that he was the Messiah that had been prophesied in Jewish scripture. And then later on, it's in the Council of Nicaea, you get the idea that Jesus was or is God incarnate who was sacrificed for the sins of all who believe in him. It's really something that comes much later, at least in a formal sense. I mean, Paul does talk about how if you believe on Jesus, you'll be saved. But his understanding of Jesus as incarnate God isn't quite there. You know, that's actually something that comes a little bit later. Once it becomes doctrine, then it's read into the Gospels. But you don't really find this in such a blind and plain way in the Gospels so much. That's a theological statement about Jesus as a member of the Trinity that actually comes much later. And then there are the Mandeans, who I've mentioned, and according to them, Jesus was a pretender, at best a clever magician, and John the Baptist was the actual Messiah of prophecy. So there were lots of different versions of Jesus that were running around. Now, in talking about this, we do have to talk about the earliest persecutions of Christians, because it's something that, that deeply sort of embedded itself in the Christian community. The idea of martyrdom profoundly affected evolving theologies, as I say, and ways of seeing the world. For example, one of the first kind of famous martyrs, Justin Martyr, in the early 2nd century, he became known because he was martyred, but he also he argued that only Christians, and that it's only Christians who interpret the Hebrew scriptures correctly. That Jews don't even have the power to interpret their own scriptures. And the proof of that is that they don't believe in Jesus. And the fact that he said that and then was martyred, that sort of lent, for Christian communities, sort of a credence to what he was saying. As I mentioned, that Tertullian was so convinced by the dignity of the Montanist Christian martyrs that he actually left the Church of Rome and converted to Montanism. And the specter and memory of martyrdom colored the manner in which Augustine would argue for the killing of non-believers for the good of their soul in certain circumstances. And this was in the City of God, which would be used as an excuse for inquisitorial practices many, many centuries later. So, and the valorization of martyrdom was so extreme that in some cases the Roman bishops had to forbid people from voluntarily entering the arena with the conviction that they would automatically be sent to heaven if they martyred themselves. You know what I mean? There are records of people actually just being so moved that they would just leap into the arena, because they came to believe that they would instantly go to heaven. What we do know is that the earliest recorded persecutions of Christians was by Jewish authorities. And of course, Paul is the first example that we have of this. And that was within the first decade or two, although after the fall of the Second Temple, that obviously stopped. And then the first recorded persecutions of Christians by Romans happened under Nero, and that was a localized instance in the city of Rome. There was a fire in Rome, and he blamed it on them. And there was a minor persecution there, but it was just in Rome. There were instances of persecution in individual locations, but there wasn't a large-scale set of persecutions until Marcus Aurelius, which was in the late 2nd century. He, and which is ironic because Marcus Aurelius, he's one of the cool emperors. He was a philosopher. He wrote Stoic philosophy. His meditations are great, but he didn't like Christians very well. He thought they were stupid. Now, many of the persecutions that one hears about were actually occurred in provincial towns. rather than in Rome, Rome proper, the city of Rome, because Rome was really too difficult to make trouble in. It was too large and varied. It was, I mean, the word cosmopolitan was invented to describe it. I mean, literally, the term cosmopolitan means the world is your city, essentially. So there weren't a lot of religious persecutions that happened in Rome proper. So most of the persecutions happened in the provinces. And generally the charges had to do with not following taxation laws. When you paid your taxes in Rome, you had to go to the temple, you'd pay your taxes, and then you'd sacrifice an animal to a pagan god at a temple. And this was often seen as blasphemous by early Christians, and so they wouldn't do it. Oftentimes what Christians would do is they would pay a pagan neighbor to take their taxes and to do the sacrifice for them, But sometimes Christians would get angry and they'd get in a mob and they would trouble the temples, and that could get them sacrificed. However, most persecutions were periodic, and Christians were not the only minority religions that were persecuted. Gnostic sectarians were persecuted. Manichaeans were persecuted, whether they were Christians or not. Non-Roman pagans and Jews were persecuted for different reasons, depending on the ruler and the politics at the time. So it's not fair to say that only Christians were persecuted, because that is not true. Now, the worst period of Christian persecution did occur under Diocletian, and this was in the late 2nd to early 3rd century. He came right before Constantine. And Diocletian reformed the rule of the Roman Empire in a number of different ways, and getting rid of Christians was one of his goals, because he saw them as rabble-rousers and people who didn't pay their taxes and didn't believe in the order of the state. It didn't want to, abide by the order of the state. So when Christian history thinks of Christian persecutions, the Christians in the arena with the lions and everything, they're usually thinking about Diocletian, the Diocletian persecution, and then they sort of retroactively project it backwards as if all persecutions were like Diocletian. And that's not true. The Diocletian persecution was very specific, and it was very targeted, and it involved the entire empire. So that was different. But he died, basically, and he was supplanted by Constantine. We'll talk about that in the next, how that happened in the next video. But Constantine was responsible for establishing Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire. And then, once that happened and was put in place, Christian authorities would persecute pagans and Jews. So they sort of would get their own back, if you will. You have to remember, they were Romans. They may be Christians now, but they were still Romans. Now, this great persecution of Diocletian began, we know specifically when it began. It began in the year 303, on February 23rd of the modern calendar. It was actually the month of March for the Romans. And it began with the destruction of a very large church at Nicomedia, which is now in present-day Turkey. So it was in the Eastern Empire. And there are very good eyewitness accounts of this attack, which basically attacked a very large church that was in a prominent city in the Eastern Empire and razed it to the ground and killed everyone in it. The graphic that you see here is of one of the sub-emperors. One of the things that Diocletian did was he created the Tetrarchy, as it was called. So you had him as the main emperor, but then you had these 4 little mini emperors that were under him, immediate subordinates. He divided the empire into 4 sections. 2 sections, east and west, and then both the west and the east were divided into north and south sections. And so each one of those quarters, if you will, had a little mini emperor. So what this is Galerius, who was one of the mini emperors who was in charge of the quadrant that Nicomedia was in. Nicomedia was in, and he's raised that church, and he's sacrificing to his gods in victory about the commencement of this persecution. So now we have to talk a little bit about some of the early church fathers, and I most especially want to talk about what are called the African fathers, because what isn't really understood, but was known at the time, was that the Northern African churches were really, really very important, and some of the most important early theologians of the church, of the early church, and this is prior to the Council of Nicaea, were black dudes. They were African dudes. Tertullian probably being the most important of some of the early ones. He was an important early theologian of the church. He was strongly influenced by the Greco-Roman philosopher Plotinus. He's known for he wrote prodigiously, and much of what he wrote has survived. He was an apologist against the Gnostics. What an apologist is someone who defends against. The Greek term apologia means to defend against, or to defend oneself. So he was an apologist against the Christian Gnostics, and under the influence of Montanist teachings. As I say here, he first articulated an idea of the Trinity, and this is based on the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus, who actually was incredibly important. He was a pagan, but his work as a Neoplatonic philosopher and developing sort of an idea of the hypostasis, it was a way in which he was trying to explain how forms, abstract things, become physical. Okay. He influenced Gnosticism immensely, but he also influenced some of the early theologies of the church. And so using some of his ideas and some of the Montanists, being inspired by the Montanists, Tertullian actually was the first person to use the word Trinity to describe the different persons or aspects of God. The word is Trinitas. And that idea was used by the Nicene Committee to develop the idea of the Trinity, which of course made its way into the Nicene Creed. Now, he died a heretic of the church, okay, because he converted to Montanism, but his writings were kept because they were very, very valuable. So it's one of those really weird instances where, a heretic's work is so valuable to the later project of the church that they actually keep a heretic's writings. It's just like, well, he wasn't a heretic then, that kind of thing. And he died in 220. And then there was a guy named Cyprian, and Cyprian is actually one of my favorites. He was not so much a philosopher. He was a Berber bishop. He's the first guy that we know of who was a Berber. He's born of nomads, and he lived in Tunisia. And he was not so much a philosopher, but he was very concerned with the pastoral aspects of Christianity. And so his writings and his letters really reflect that. He's trying to keep the Christian community together against persecutions and against heresies and against, he's trying to deal with people who are very poor. He's trying to bridge the class systems there. And he's just a good guy. He's like one of these people, you read him and you're like, this is an okay person. And he was martyred at Roman hands in 258. So he died a martyr, as well as being a very important African apologist for the church. But probably the most famous of all of the African fathers was Augustine himself. Augustine was a black man from Northern Africa. And I will say that again, Augustine was a black man from Northern Africa. He was also a post-Nicene father. In other words, did most of his writing after the Nicene Creed. And he's considered basically the father of the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church. So if you want to know where Roman Catholic stuff comes from, you have to know Augustine. He's the one who kind of sets the terms. He basically provided the theological blueprint for the post-Nicene, post-Visigothic sack of Rome in his huge philosophical work, City of God. He provides the Western Church with like a vision of what they can do to survive in this, post-imperial world, which is ruled by, Germanic warlords, essentially. He provided the rationale for the doctrine of original sin, and eventually what would become the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which, isn't proclaimed until the late 19th century, but it's still an important idea in the church, even though it isn't determined to be, absolute doctrine until, quite late. Now, what's interesting about Augustine is that he was originally a Manichaean, or he was training to be a Manichaean, but he converted to Christianity. And so a lot of Manichaean ideas actually strangely make their way into some of his theological understandings. In fact, there's pretty good evidence that some of his notions about original sin, the way in which he conceives of it, is sort of a biological taint. I mean, that's the best way to understand it. Probably was influenced by certain Manichaean ideas. So he's one of those interesting dudes, If you want to read somebody, I mean, I always enjoyed reading him, even though I just really disagreed with him, and found him to be, an arrogant butthole. He's still really interesting, He was also a Scorpio, for those of you who care about that kind of thing. He was killed in a Visigothic raid in 430 when Visigothic raiders came and sacked the city he was living in. So he also died rather tragically. All three of these dudes died rather tragically. And then, of course, there were the Desert Fathers. Now, the Desert Fathers are not considered to be part of the African church, but many of them were African, because the movement of the Desert Fathers was focused in Northern Africa, particularly Egypt. So a lot of them would have been. But who the Desert Fathers were, they were leaders of communities that spread first throughout Northern Africa and Egypt, and they became the basis for the monastic communities that would become commonplace in both the Western and Eastern churches. Now, some of these early communities were Gnostic, and we know this. I mean, the Nag Hammadi corpus was found, in the tomb of one of these dudes, and many of them may have formed out of early Coptic churches, and they went into the desert to emulate, John the Baptist and Jesus going into the wilderness, but also to escape the Roman authorities. We know that that's why the Manichaeans ended up in the desert with a lot of these people. They were doing that too, and they were doing that to escape, persecution. So eventually what ended up happening is that the Roman Church sought to bring many of them under the wing of the Catholic Church when the Catholic Church became the Catholic Church. And by the way, the term Catholic means universal, okay? What the Catholic Church sought to do, the Church in Rome, once it was organized and the papacy was established, what it sought to do was sort of reach out to far-flung Christian communities and sort of bring them all under the umbrella, if you will, of the Church in Rome. And eventually they would attempt to control them in one way or another. But the first kind of official monastic order that came out of the Desert Fathers was the Benedictine order, or the Rule of Benedict. And that, I think that the Rule of Benedict, I'm trying to remember, I'll know in the next video, but it was some time after the sack of Rome, I believe. But the Desert Fathers also sort of kept, once Rome was sacked, and the Visigoths were running all over the place, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths were running all over the place. The Desert Fathers were one of the kind of strands of continuity, especially in far-flung rural Christian communities, that because of the fall of the Western Empire, they kind of lost touch with, the Church in Rome, and they lost touch with other, as the Roman Empire in the West sort of collapsed and roads weren't maintained, and, the army drew back, and, and so it was not safe to travel anymore. It was the Desert Fathers who often sort of kept these communities in far-flung places together. Now, there are many collections of the Desert Fathers' writings and lives, and many of them were important. Like, for example, St. Jerome, who's credited with the Latin Bible, was also a Desert Father. He was also a monastic person. Gregory of Nyssa, who is considered to be one of the fathers of the Eastern Church, was another. So this was happening at this time as well. So these are just a couple of graphics. The guy on the left, this is Cyprian. This is an icon of Cyprian, and he looks a little more Greek there, but you can see how dark his skin is, and there are some depictions of him that are more white than others. But there are other depictions in which he's very clearly a Berber. He's got African hair, and he's very clearly a black guy. I guess to me that's really important to know that a lot of the really important early Christian theologians and people who kept the church alive, some of the earliest churches in the world were African churches. And that's important because Christianity is often seen today by people who don't know the history of Christianity as just sort of a European white imposition. And it wasn't originally. Originally it was multicultural, and some of the most important people in the early church were what folks we'd call people of color now. Didn't have to call them that then, because skin color was not the issue then that it is now. But it's important to know that. I mean, I remember when I taught a Western Civ class, and I brought up that Augustine, we were talking about Augustine in the class, and I brought up that Augustine was an African and black man, and in his Confessions he talks about the color of his skin, how dark his skin is, and one of my students it just freaked him out. I mean, not in a bad way. It was like, they'd been raised Catholic, and they had been shown depictions of Augustine, and and always white, and when they realized he was a black African, they were just like, oh my God, why aren't we told this? So I'm telling you. On the right is this is not an icon. This is actually a depiction of Saint Anthony, who's probably one of the most famous of the Desert Fathers, and depicting him being tempted. And this is by Bosch, H. Bosch, the crazy guy who, the Flemish painter, in the early Renaissance, who did all these surrealistic things about, pictures about hell and stuff. Well, this is his picture of St. Anthony, and it's a very famous picture. What St. Anthony was known for were all his bizarre visions. He would have these bizarre visions where, demons would be biting him and tempting him with sexual pleasures and tempting him with gluttony. And he reported he could see them, and they would like be in his skin. When you read him now, you think, this guy just, probably needs medication. But he, that's what he was known for, were all his temptations, and that he conquered all of them, essentially. I probably shouldn't make fun of him, but it's just, when you read some of these people now, you're just like when you read Augustine now. I mean, I do appreciate Augustine, but when you read him now, you're just like, if the man could just have had a sex therapist, he probably would have been a little calmer. But still Christian, but a little calmer. Maybe he would not have had such an issue with his sexual organ, which really disturbs him, because apparently he had erections sort of spontaneously, and they really bothered him, and he talks about how much they bother him. And it's because his organ, as he puts it, seems to have a life of its own, that he concludes that this must be proof that it's evidence of the taint of original sin in his flesh. That's what I mean. It's kind of like, they're intense. They are intense people. Now, what that has to do with Jesus, that's a good question. I don't know. But that's sort of the way in which some of them were headed. And when you think about the fact that Augustine becomes sort of the father of the Western Church. Well, if the Western Church has some problems with sex, they probably came by it honestly, because they listened to Augustine. Anyway, these are the visual sources in order of appearance, and that's where we stand right at this point. On to the next.